Hello family, and welcome to House Party. We've been in a 4-week series called Between the Past and the Promise. I've really enjoyed learning and growing and teaching it, and I hope you've enjoyed hearing it, and hope it's made a difference in your life. We've been talking about between the past and the promise, and that between part of our life, we likened it to the wilderness that the Israelites had to walk through after coming out of Egypt, and we've learned a lot of things in this study. We concluded this week with a question: what keeps us between? There's a time when in God's economy, 2 years, actually 14 months, was all God wanted to keep Israel in the wilderness, in the between phase, before they entered into the promised land. But they reneged, they backed out, and they wouldn't believe God's promise, and so they went back to the wilderness for 40 years until all the previous generation died out. And so I conclude this series with what keeps us between. What is meant as a tool for God's purposes in going through a wilderness season of your life sometimes becomes a trap. And what was a tool becomes a trap. And unfortunately, for many people, they never enter into God's full promise for their life because they're trapped by this wilderness between place in their life, and they never get through to the promise. And we talked about two things this week. We talked about two things that keeps us trapped in the wilderness and keeps us not pursuing God's promise. And the first one was fear. Fear was the original reason when Israel got to the borders of the promised land, and they sent spies in to check out the land, and the spies came back, and 2 had a good report, but 10 had an evil report of the land. And they caused the whole nation of Israel to go into fear that they could not achieve God's promise, and God was not with them, and that they were all going to be slain trying to take the promised land. And so it was that fear that turned them back into the wilderness for 40 years. And you and I experience fear many times on many levels, but particularly during the wilderness experience of our lives, we are prone to fear. We have fear of the unknown. We have fear of failure. What if I try to follow God's command and I fail? Fear of disappointment, or fear of the risk. What's it going to cost me to leave where I am to go into God's promise? And that's a risky proposition. And anything that involves faith involves risk. So fear is one thing that keeps us locked into the wilderness and keeps us from the promised land. But the other thing we talked about was familiarity. Familiarity. Familiarity is the subtle assassin of God's promise to you. It's the status quo. It's finding a status quo in the wilderness. Something that you just accept. It's a slow adaptation to living life between your past and your promise until it's just a routine anymore. You're used to a status quo living outside of God's promise. That's a dangerous place to be. I read a book once by A.W. Tozer called Rut, Rot, or Revival. Rut, Rot, or Revival. And he points out this very fact, that familiarity and being used to God's presence, and even in church, sometimes we get familiar with the routine of what's happening in a church service until when God really shows up, sometimes it doesn't even faze us because we're so used to what's going on. And that's a dangerous place to be because familiarity blocks the flow of supernatural power and strength to a person's life. And comfort, because of familiarity, comfort becomes an enemy at that stage. And it looks like familiarity is the ally, but really it's working against you. And here's the insidious nature of familiarity. In familiarity, listen, you can have a good life in familiar places, in the status quo, in the wilderness. You can have a good life in the wilderness. You can have good friends. You can have a good marriage. You can have a good career. You can have money. You can have esteem. You can have fame even. You can have all those things in the wilderness, but the one thing you cannot have in the wilderness and in familiarity is God's promise and God's purpose. You can't have that living in familiarity, because in familiarity we think we no longer need those things because we've got a good life. Why do I want to leave my good life and go into an unknown future? See? So fear and familiarity are the two things that work against us in the wilderness to keep us there when God wants us to get through the wilderness and go on to the promise. So my question for you, I only have one question for you today for you to discuss and maybe even pray together about, is in your personal life, in your experience, evaluate where you are now. And which of these two, fear or familiarity, poses the greater threat to you living in God's promise for your life? I hope you'll have some good discussion about that, and pray over each other about that. And don't be trapped in the wilderness when God said it's time for you to leave. Listen, have a great time tonight or today, and enjoy the fellowship together, and we'll see you next time. God bless you.